All right, let's dive in. Today we're taking a deep dive into the philosophy of Charles Hartshorne. He's been called one of the most um, significant metaphysicians of the 20th century. Pretty impressive, right?
Definitely. And for good reason. Hartshorne didn't just accept those traditional arguments for God's existence. He kind of turned the whole understanding of how God exists on its head.
Yeah, and we'll see why in just a minute. So for this deep dive, we're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Hartshorne. Should be pretty interesting.
Absolutely. Especially, for someone who already spends a lot of time thinking about these big philosophical questions, right?
Right. And one of the first things that struck me about Hartshorne is that he kind of starts off by challenging traditional theism.
Yeah.
That whole idea of God being immutable and absolutely perfect.
Yeah, that very classical view.
Right, exactly. So where does he go from there?
Well, he argued that that way of looking at God, it's too limited. He saw God as much more dynamically involved in the world, like constantly changing and becoming.
That's interesting. Almost as if traditional theism sees God as like a fixed point, and Hartshorne sees God as more like, I don't know, a river or something, but constantly flowing, changing.
That's a great analogy, yeah. He even went as far as saying that God has both necessary and contingent attributes. Like God's existence is necessary, but God's knowledge of, say, contingent events, well, that's contingent.
Whoa, okay, now that's a fascinating distinction. It really challenges how we usually think about God's attributes. So how does he even begin to reconcile those ideas?
Well, that's where this concept of dipolar theism comes in.
Dipolar
Yeah.
theism. Okay, I'm listening.
Yeah. So it's this idea that God kind of embodies both poles of different contrasts, like permanence and change, or one and many, even activity and passivity.
So it's not just choosing one extreme or the other, but like holding that tension between them.
Exactly. So, you could say that God is steadfast, right? Which would be kind of a form of excellent permanence. But also at the same time, God's profoundly responsive to suffering in the world. And that is a form of excellent change.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So how does this bipolar nature change our understanding of, God's relationship to creation?
Well, it reframes the whole thing. It means we're not dealing with this detached, unchanging God.
Okay, so thinking about this as philosophers, what are some of the implications of this view? Like, how does it challenge traditional philosophical problems? Like the problem of evil, for example.
Well, if God is truly, genuinely responsive to suffering, then God isn't just some, detached observer of the world's pain.
Right.
God is actually affected by it.
Yeah.
Deeply. So it really challenges that idea of a God who just kind of allows suffering but doesn't experience it, you know?
Yeah, that's a powerful point. Definitely shifts the whole conversation. So we have a God who's both changing and deeply connected to the world. Where does Hartshorne go from there?
Well, this leads us to another pretty crucial part of his philosophy, this idea of panentheism.
Panentheism. All right, let's hear it.
So it's the idea that all is, in a sense, in God.
Hold on. We need to be careful here, right? Because it's easy to mix that up with pantheism.
Oh, absolutely. And they're definitely not the same thing.
Right. Could you maybe break that down a bit?
Yeah, sure. So pantheism says that God and the universe are literally the same thing. But panentheism, it's a little bit more nuanced. It suggests that the world is included in God, but through God's omniscience and omnibenevolence. So everything is within God's awareness and care, but God is also something more than just, the total sum of the universe.
Okay, yeah. I think I see the distinction now. But how does this panentheistic view actually play out in Hartshorne's thinking?
He uses this analogy of God as the soul or mind of the universe.
Okay.
And the world is kind of like God's body. So everything that happens in the universe is happening within God's own quote unquote body.
So God experiences every joy, every sorrow, every little thing that happens because it's all happening within God.
Exactly. It's a powerful image, right? Really different from that idea of a detached, unchanging being.
Yeah, it really is. I got to admit, this is making me rethink a lot of my assumptions about, God and the nature of reality. I'm really curious to see where this goes. So what are some of the philosophical implications of this panentheistic view?
Well, I think one of the big things is it kind of, blurs the lines between God's actions and what we do, if everything is happening within God, how do we even separate what God does versus what we do?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It really challenges that traditional separation between the divine and the human, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. It suggests a much more like interconnected and collaborative relationship between God and creation, I think.
So instead of God acting like from the outside, it's more like God is acting from within, both influencing and being influenced by everything that happens.
Exactly. And that leads to another crucial point that Hartshorne makes. He argues that because God is dipolar, God is not omnipotent in the traditional sense.
Hold on, wait. God isn't all-powerful? I mean, that's a pretty bold claim, especially for someone who's arguing for God's existence.
Yeah, it is. But, remember that Hartshorne's whole idea of perfection is very different from the classical view. He actually argues that the traditional idea of omnipotence, that God can do absolutely anything, it's actually incompatible with the idea that we're free creatures.
So if we have even like a tiny little bit of freedom to act independently, God can't be totally controlling everything.
Exactly. He suggests that God's power is actually limited by the freedom of creatures. So God can persuade and influence, but not, like, dictate.
Huh. Which, thinking about this philosophically, that raises some pretty interesting questions about like free will and determinism. You know,
Yeah.
if God isn't controlling our every move, how do we account for our choices and actions? Are we truly free, or are we just like playing out some predetermined script?
Yeah, those are some of the big questions that Hartshorne really grapples with. And he doesn't shy away from the complexity of it all. He actually sees this dynamic interplay between God's influence and our freedom as a really essential part of what makes creation meaningful.
Almost like a dance, what did
Mm.
you say? Like God leads, but we have the freedom to, follow or resist. And that tension creates something beautiful, something unpredictable.
I like that analogy. Yeah, it really captures that kind of dynamism and creativity that Hartshorne sees at the heart of reality.
So we've got this picture of God who's both like deeply involved in the world, immanent, but also respects our freedom. But there's still that question about God's power, right? If God isn't omnipotent in that traditional sense, what kind of power does God have?
Well, Hartshorne argues that God's power is more like the power of persuasion, of love, of creativity. It's the power to inspire, to guide, to kind of draw us towards what is uh, what is good and beautiful.
It's a very different way of thinking about divine power than we usually see in, traditional theology.
Definitely. And it has some pretty profound implications for how we understand God's action in the world too.
Okay, so how does all this tie back to, Hartshorne's dipolar theism?
Right. Well, remember one of the key aspects of that is God's mutability, right? That whole idea that God is capable of change.
Right.
Yeah.
Another departure from the traditional view of God is unchanging.
Exactly. Hartshorne argues that because God is in this dynamic relationship with the world, God is constantly changing in response to our experiences as creatures,
Yeah.
It's like a constant evolution, a becoming.
So every time we experience, joy or sorrow, God is experiencing those things with us.
Mm.
And that experience is actually changing God.
In a sense, yeah, God's knowledge and experience are constantly being enriched by our lives, by the lives of all creatures, really.
Wow, okay, that's a mind-blowing concept. It's like
Yeah.
God is learning and growing right alongside us.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. And it really challenges us to rethink, those traditional notions of divine perfection. Like if God is constantly changing, then perfection can't be this static, unchanging state.
So instead of God being like perfectly unchanging, God is perfectly responsive, perfectly loving, perfectly engaged with the world, even if that means that God is also changing.
You got it. It's a radical rethinking of what divine perfection might actually mean. And it has like profound implications for how we understand God's actions in the world.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
We talked about Hartshorne's challenges to traditional theism,
Mm.
his dipolar view of God, the concept of panentheism, God's mutability, and even, touched on how these ideas challenge those traditional philosophical problems like
Yeah.
the problem of evil and free will.
Yeah, and how all of those concepts kind of intersect to create a new understanding of God's power and action in the world. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a lot to take in. But I think it's worth, wrestling with these ideas,
Mm.
especially for a philosopher, someone who's already used to grappling with these big questions about the nature of reality.
I agree. It's challenging, but I think ultimately Hartshorne offers a very hopeful and inspiring vision of God. A God who intimately connected to the world, who cares about our suffering, who is constantly evolving and becoming right alongside us.
That's a beautiful way to put it. So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into Charles Hartshorne's dipolar theism,
Mhm.
we'll leave you with that image, the image of a God who is not distant or detached, but deeply involved in the unfolding drama of creation.
And while Hartshorne's views might challenge those traditional assumptions, they really do open up some exciting new avenues for philosophical and theological exploration.
So keep pondering, keep questioning, and keep exploring that fascinating world of Charles Hartshorne's thought. Until next time, happy philosophizing.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. It really is a fascinating and complex vision of God. And, for a philosopher like you, it must open up like a whole new world of questions, possibilities.
It does, yeah. I think, Hartshorne really gives us a framework for understanding God that is, well, both intellectually rigorous
Hmm.
and deeply moving.
Yeah. And, thinking about all this, one question that keeps coming back to me is if Hartshorne is right about this, if God really is internally related to the world like this, experiencing everything that happens within creation, well, how does that change how we understand God's actions in the world?
That's a great question. It really gets at, like, the heart of what makes Hartshorne's thought so challenging and so compelling. It really forces us to, like, rethink everything we thought we knew about, divine action. Because if God's feeling and experiencing everything that happens in the universe, then
Hmm.
God's actions can't be seen as, detached or impersonal, right? It's like
Yeah.
this incredibly close, interwoven relationship where God is both influencing and being influenced by creation.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not that top-down model where God's just imposing God's will on a passive world. It's more like, like we were saying earlier, it's more like a dance where God and creation are constantly moving and responding to one another.
So does that mean that, like, every event, every action, every choice is somehow orchestrated by God?
Not necessarily, no. Remember, Hartshorne's still emphasizing the freedom of creatures.
Right.
We still have the ability to choose, to act, to create, but our actions, they have repercussions. And not just for ourselves, but for God as well.
Because God experiences the consequences of our choices.
Right. And that experience, it shapes and changes God. It's a reciprocal relationship, this constant give and take.
Hmm. That really changes how we might think about some traditional theological concepts, like prayer or miracles. I mean, if God's already so intimately involved in every aspect of creation, what does it even mean for God to intervene?
That's a question worth exploring, definitely. Maybe it's less about God breaking into the world from the outside and more about, recognizing those subtle ways that God's already working within, like the very fabric of reality.
So maybe miracles aren't so much about, these big supernatural events, but more about those moments where we become more aware of God's presence in just the ordinary, everyday stuff of life.
Exactly. It's about seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary, recognizing that divine spark in every creature in every moment.
It's a beautiful, a really profound vision, and it kind of challenges us to live our lives differently, doesn't it? To see the world through new eyes, to really appreciate that interconnectedness of all things.
It does, yeah. I think Hartshorne's dipolar theism really invites us to embrace that, embrace the complexity and the wonder of a God who is both transcendent and immanent,
Mm.
both unchanging and ever evolving, both powerful and, vulnerable.
Yeah, powerful stuff. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the thought of Charles Hartshorne, we'll leave you with this. If God really is, as Hartshorne describes, depolar, mutable, panentheistic well, how does that change your understanding of your own place in the universe? How does it shape your relationship with the divine, with the
Yeah.
world around you, and even with yourself? Those are some questions worth pondering as you continue your own philosophical journey. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.